Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon, and thank you for attending today's webinar, MRB Check, Screening for Marijuana-Related Risk and Relationships. My name is Karin Rines, and I'm the Marketing Manager for the Risk Business at Refinitiv, and I'll be your webinar host today. Before we begin, I'd like to cover a couple of housekeeping items. First, just a couple of technical points. There is no dial-in number for the audio. You'll use your device's speakers and plug in your headphones to listen to the audio. Click on the media player on your screen, which will enable you to activate the sound and ensure that Flash is also enabled on your browser. And if your screen freezes up, simply refresh your browser. This will usually clear that problem. If you have any other technical difficulty during the webcast, please click on the Help widget, which is the question mark icon on the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. This covers troubleshooting for common technical issues. You can expand or minimize your slide and video windows by clicking on the maximize icon at the top right of your screen, or at the window, or by dragging the bottom right corner of the slide area to expand the window. And at the top right corner of your audience console is the Q&A box. Please submit any questions that you have in this box. Our presenters will answer as many questions as they can during the last 5 to 10 minutes of the broadcast. And finally, the link to the recorded webcast, a copy of the slides, and other resources will be emailed to you after the conclusion of the event. Our presenters today are Holly Philippi, Head of Risk Proposition Sales at Refinitiv, and Steve Kemmerling, Founder and CEO of CRB Monitor. Their bios are available for viewing on your screen. You can simply click and read more about them. With that, I'll turn it over to Holly to get the discussion underway. Holly, it's all yours.
Great, thanks, Karin. So thank you, everybody, for joining us today. I'm really excited to have an opportunity to talk with Stephen about our MRB offering within Refinitiv, but really we're going to focus today on a little bit about the regulatory landscape and then talking about some of the requirements that we've seen our clients within the financial industry and corporate looking at to make sure that they are operating within the regulatory landscape, but also making sure from a risk perspective that they're taking a look at that. So before we get started, just because we are all virtual now, I'd like to ask Steve just to do a bit of a deeper introduction. That way you get familiar with Steve, who is, as Karin mentioned, the founder and CEO of CRB Monitor. So Steve, could you do a quick introduction, please?
Sure. Thanks, Holly and Karin. Steve Kemmerling, founder of CRB Monitor. Some of you might have heard of me in the past. We are CRB Monitor is focused exclusively on aggregating data around the marijuana business, marijuana industry, specifically around the businesses, the ownership, and the licensing information. At this point, we're generally exclusively utilized by financial institutions and or law enforcement to understand, identify, and manage marijuana-related risks and opportunities. Started the company in 2014 and very excited to be partnering with Refinitiv on this product, MRB Check, powered by CRB Monitor. And we'll get into the details here shortly.
Great, thanks. So as I mentioned, right, we're going to dig in a little bit today. Many of you may have listened to a few of the different sessions that Steve and I have been honored to be a part of within ACAMS and the broader industry when talking about banking marijuana-related businesses, whether you choose to make the decision of not banking or banking, and then also within the corporate sector, just understanding those dynamics as well. So today we're going to spend a little bit more time digging into the weeds a little bit, talking about the specific market landscape, but also talking about some of the key best practices that we've seen some of the clients that we work with today have adopted in their decision-making, whether that is you've decided to bank marijuana-related businesses or not. So I think what we'll do is just jump in and get started. And I thought just to kick us off, the best place to start would be what's the landscape? So Steve, can you talk to us a little bit about the current landscape and what we look at for what the growth trajectory looks like?
Yeah, definitely. It's an interesting, dynamic, constantly changing market. I should note here that pretty much everything in this presentation is specific to the marijuana industry, and that basically, quick definitional topic, it means cannabis with THC, the plant that is still federally illegal, separate and distinct from hemp and CBD. So the following really refers to that. Basically, it's a large and growing market. I believe this graph is worldwide, but in the U.S., we're projected to hit in the 20 billion plus revenue, retail revenue size over the next couple of years, if not this year. It's important to note that these revenue estimates, pretty much all the estimates I ever see, are really based on point of sale or retail sales, meaning when a consumer walks in and buys a marijuana product at the end of the supply chain that takes it home. And the reason that's important is really because you have to look at this number, let's call it 20 billion, and apply roughly to a 2.5 or 3 times multiple to account for the entire marijuana supply chain, from the cultivator to the marijuana processor or wholesaler, and all those interconnecting supply chains, all of which are direct marijuana-related businesses. So if you're seeing a $20 billion estimate, and I know it's a bit of an airball, but you're really starting to look at 40, 50, 60 billion dollars in direct marijuana-related proceeds. We didn't include a map, but CRB monitors currently tracking regulated marijuana markets in 42 U.S. and Canadian states and territories. Actually, no, that's just U.S., 42 U.S. states and territories, including Puerto Rico, Guam, Northern Mariana Islands, maybe places farther away than you might realize, but they are U.S. territories. So it's basically ubiquitous or near ubiquitous at this point. The cash is flowing. It's a number of states. The numbers keep growing, as does the overall risk and opportunity. There's a number of factors to consider when looking at this, but I think you're going to follow through on those as well here, Holly.
So one of the reasons I think it's good to start with just what that landscape looks like and the growth is I've heard several comments, especially this year, on marijuana-related businesses just from a growth and, like you mentioned, revenue, right? That this industry did not see any slowdown through COVID this year. Actually, we talked to several of our clients and colleagues in industry that do bank the businesses, and they've actually seen their revenues certainly increase. And I think we've seen that volume of increase overall. But I think that lends itself to the next piece of the discussion where, we have that you'll see on the slide around the legislation and the industry. And it is complex, right? I mean, it's complex to the point where, Steve, you had to call out the definition of what marijuana related businesses means in this context. So I always think having to start with what does that mean and the definition just highlights again that it is complex. It's not just something that's black and white. And I think that is also where we start to see some questions when we start to look at, do you decide that you want to start to do business with any marijuana related businesses, whether that be banking them, working with their supply chain? Those are decisions that, certainly at least most of our clients, and I think also on your side, they don't take those decisions lightly. But I think what that does is, as you're making that decision and saying, yes, we are going to take this on, where we've seen that really successful is for our clients that have very strong BSA policies in place already, right? So there's a very strong framework in place. And then you layer on the risk that you want to take on. And there's a couple bullet points here, right, that we're all fairly familiar with: monitoring, ongoing monitoring, developing, very strong practices on who you will do business with, What do you anticipate their revenues being? Where do you think that those outliers might be? But then I think equally important, and one thing that gets brought up quite a bit, is when we hear, different institutions say, I'm just going to have a policy that I'm not going to do business with any MRB businesses right now because I'm not comfortable with the current legislation and regulatory environment. And I think that that's a fairly easy statement to make. I think where that gets complex is that it's not straightforward. So a lot of times you are banking unknowingly, perhaps, businesses that are marijuana related businesses, whether that be you're lending for a commercial space and lo and behold, the individuals that are leasing that space is actually a marijuana business. So I think that's where it starts to become complex. One of the things that I'm actually really excited that we're doing this today is a lot of the discussions that we've had when we talk about that legislation and regulatory landscape has been pre-election. And so there's been a lot of comments that were made, well, let's see how the election goes, because there's also the MORES Act on the table and the legislation, based off election results could change the landscape. So I do want to touch on that a little bit while we're here, just in the fact that, that does continue to come up. I anticipate we'll have a question about it. What does the MORES Act really mean? Does the MORES Act mean, oh, great, right? It's going to become legal at a federal level. Therefore, all of this regulatory landscape or the requirements for monitoring go to the wayside. So, Steve, I know you've been watching that carefully and have had, there's been updates. I think you just updated me an hour ago.
This morning, yeah.
I wasn't aware of.
Right.
So can you talk to us a little bit about what that means?
Yeah, definitely. So it's something we're keenly aware of and how it may or may not impact, our clients and what they need to do or don't need to do as it relates to marijuana or cannabis-related businesses. So, so first of all, there's been a lot of headlines over the past couple of weeks. And we don't have enough time to break down all the politics about what President Biden feels about marijuana or President-elect, I guess I should say, versus Vice President-elect. But the MORES Act specifically, this was just coming out, I think, last night and this morning, that congressmen are adding more language to the MORES Act, which isn't surprising at all to me, that makes it start to look and feel similar to something like the 2018 Farm Bill Act, meaning the 2018 Farm Bill legalized hemp, but it did so with a lot of restrictions, rules, regulations that were and still are being promulgated and aren't yet complete. So the language that was starting to be amended to the MORES Act yesterday, I believe, and or this morning, was basically things like FDA continues to have oversight over cannabis, which just means, guess what? Federal regulation, one way or another. Even if it is a legalization, it doesn't come with just an outright legalization and everybody can start growing it and selling it, as they wish. Also comes with additional language around taxes, that there'll be a federal excise tax starting at 5% going up to 8%, which says, okay, how are they going to institute this tax if, is it on legitimate businesses? Illegitimate businesses? I think there was actually a line that I saw, I didn't read it closely, but that said something on taxes on smuggled marijuana. Like, how are you going to figure that one out? So I think the broader point is, whether it's the MORES Act, whether it's the Safe Banking Act, or something else to be determined, is this industry is going to come with a lot of regulation. And actually, last statement, I think last week, the Congressional Research Office, I think that's what it's called, the CRS, Congressional Research Service, came out with an analysis of the MORES Act that said, guess what? Okay, so the federal government legalizes it, but then you're left with a patchwork of 50 different states with 50 different sets of rules and regulations. It's legal here, it's illegal there. You can smoke it here, you can't smoke it there. Including restrictions that are more restrictive than the federal, which basically decriminalizes it. So even though I think the MORES Act is unlikely to pass or isn't going to pass, I'll bet $20 on that with you, Holly, in this current Congress, even with the next Congress, this thing's got so much legs and so much uncertainty about how it's going to roll out. It's naive, maybe is a strong word, but naive to say this challenge, this risk goes away with, I'm using air quotes, federal legalization, because there's a lot that gets packed into what does federal legalization mean. And frankly, all these bullet points here under the FinCEN guidance, I think these all remain. So whether you're going to knowingly bank the industry, you still have to presumably live up to these FinCEN expectations. But maybe these will be legislated, maybe these will be regulated. If anything, I might actually anticipate increased banking regulatory expectations around this industry. So that's as quickly as I can summarize that, Ali.
Holly, I think you're still on mute.
Oh, I am. Thanks, Karin. I think there's a lot of us on the line that'll probably be quickly looking at the MORES Act to see what's been added. I think there's quite a few of us that are following it just in general to understand what potential that landscape means. But I do think, and this is a conversation, right, that we've had for a while now, that I do agree, right, regardless of that it's going to remain a high risk industry by our definitions of how you need to monitor for that and the type of, policies and procedures you have to have in place internally. And that's really where we want to make sure that we dig in today. The majority of our attendees are certainly, within the financial industry. So very familiar with the processes and procedures on what we need to do for screening, ongoing monitoring, et cetera, within the industry. So I think it'll be great that we're going to get a little bit more granular here today in that discussion. But I will say it would not be a proper webinar without a poll question. So. So we're going to jump over to a quick poll question, and I'll ask each of you just to click on where that is. I'll read through it quickly. Which of the following describes your institution's risk-based approach regarding cannabis-related policies and procedures? We do have a select all that do apply if there's more than one. Written cannabis-related policies are in place. Differentiate between marijuana, hemp, and CBD, differentiating between tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, basically direct and indirect engagement. Cannabis-related questions on applications and documents. We're starting to see that in supply chain, so if that's you. And then, or screening tier 1, just direct MRB businesses right now. So I'm going to give everybody a few minutes. There's quite the list.
And there's one last one there that you might have to scroll down, but also screening for beneficial owners and or what I would call investment companies or shell companies.
Yes, that'll be a big one.
It is quite the list. We tried to cover all the bases with the questions.
So give it a quick minute. Let's see where we are with our results. All right, so looking at the results here, it looks like about 73%, just over 73% have written cannabis-related policies in place, which I think is fantastic. I bet if we looked at this poll even 12 months ago, it would have been a little bit different. The next 41% differentiate between tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, and then about 41% are screening for that beneficial ownership, holding and investment companies. So I think what's great is we certainly are seeing the percentages here much higher than we had even a year ago, in my opinion, on, having written policies that are actually in place related to cannabis. So I think as we move on, right, that helps us take just take a look at some of the red flags and some of the things that, you might have identified, especially when you do have those, when you do have the written policies in place, making sure that when you're putting those in place, updating those, that you're able to look for some areas that we've seen, really call out some red flags. And there's a couple here listed on the screen, and we won't read through all of them, but I think at a high level, just maybe touch on a few, which is where we've seen, the commingling of funds. So your personal account of the business owner. And, just because there are some banking restrictions, we've seen that the commingling of funds is happening within individual accounts. I know, Steve, that's been one, right, where we've called that out from a policy perspective internally, where financial institutions have said, we have a strict policy, it's a written policy, we are not going to, bank marijuana-related businesses or, engage in the fund transfers there, when we're finding that a lot of that is happening because of the commingling of funds. Could you just talk to us a little bit about that? Because I think that's been one that we've seen rather consistent.
Yeah, definitely. It's unfortunately kind of money laundering 101. It's the MRBs are, they're time and time again, both anecdotal and hard evidence indicates that MRBs do have bank accounts. The good news is more of those bank accounts are held at banks that know about them and have set up marijuana banking programs. But historically, for years, those accounts are often, if not typically, at banks that don't know. Standard money laundering 101 is use a personal account, use an seemingly unrelated business, investment company, just any other kind of company to avoid detection. It is a function of the current regulatory and legal landscape that MRBs, are to some degree forced to do this. I'm not trying to opine too much on right or wrong, but even if they're, otherwise legitimate cannabis-related businesses that are duly licensed, committing money laundering is generally still frowned upon. Tax evasion is still frowned upon. And they are using, owners, managers. And this is a big part of why we do what we do at CRB Monitor is I think we were one of the first ones, if not the first one, to start adding beneficial owners. And clients were asking me, well, why beneficial owners? I don't want to screen for beneficial owners. I'm like, well, that's where the money's coming into your institution. A lot of times MRBs aren't quite dumb enough to do it in their own name. They're using personal accounts or seemingly unrelated businesses. So, by looking at the individuals who are related to both entities, you're going to capture these. I could give you a half dozen anecdotes from clients saying, yeah, you're right. Even including banks who bank MRBs who then offer amnesty to these people they catch. And then those people 90% of the time still go across the street to another bank because they don't want to turn over beneficial ownership documents. They don't want to pay fees. They're just, unfortunately, on the sketchier side of the spectrum and just don't want you to report on them to FinCEN. So there's all sorts of reasons for MRBs to still, kind of hide their true nature. And I don't think that goes away. And this other concept that's kind of tucked in there is the seemingly unrelated business. CRB Monitor identifies those as we're unraveling ownership chains. We actually started calling them Tier 1 Bs to differentiate them from the licensed entities. So we have about 2,000 or 3,000 of these companies that you can only find when you're unraveling Secretary of State ownership or digging through a marijuana license application PDF. Again, where there could be 2 or 3 layers deep of these entities that are being constructed to hide their association to the marijuana industry. But that's also why we do what we do. Go ahead, Holly.
So I think that goes, and I made this statement a little bit earlier, right, where we've seen this really successful is, when the decision has been made to take on relationships with marijuana-related businesses, and alternatively, right, is for organizations that are starting with a strong framework, BSA framework with strong policies and procedures for onboarding, et cetera. And then adding in that layer of making sure, right, they understanding where the funds are coming from, understanding who those beneficial owners are. I think, again, just given, our audience that we have today, that beneficial ownership is always top of our mind in general. But I do want to call out a couple things that you mentioned, because I think it's important that we also put that in context, because it's also a key reason why, from a Refinitiv perspective, we were very keen to partner and start to intake the CRB monitor data for MRBs, is because of the extent that you go through for beneficial owner, right? It's not a clearly I'm just going to pull the first person that they listed on their license, right? It goes beyond that when identifying that beneficial ownership. But then also, can you tell us a little bit about when you refer to Tier 1A, Tier 1B, what do those tiers mean? Because again, I think that was one of the key reasons, right? We know our clients wanted to have a data set that was very clearly defined. And I think that helps do it. So could you just talk through those 2 points?
Yeah, thanks for the reminder. Sometimes I forget that, sometimes I'm speaking a little bit of Greek. So for reference, and I'm happy to send it to anyone who wants it, or it's on our website at crbmonitor.com. In 2016, I authored an article / white paper for ACAMS today called Defining Marijuana-Related Businesses, where I basically just took the concept of FinCEN's direct and indirect marijuana-related business language from their guidance in 2014 and kind of unraveled it further and clarified it further based on the fact that we've been developing this database for 6 years, and I had to determine, well, what is a marijuana business, what isn't, because it's a bit of a slippery slope. So definitionally, a Tier 1 marijuana-related business, in my parlance or a framework, is generally it's going to be a plant-touching licensed entity, marijuana licensed entity. So it's going to be along your supply chain, plant-touching. So that generally is going to be your growers, the guys putting the seeds into the ground. The next kind of major step would be your processors. These are people who are taking the grown marijuana from the growers. They're breaking it down into subcomponents. We typically lump processors and manufacturers together. Manufacturer would be someone who's making a marijuana infused edible, drinks, and 500 or 1,000 plus other products you can make out of marijuana. And you have wholesalers who are basically buying those products, whether from the cultivator or the manufacturer or the processor, and moving them to the retailer. Then ultimately the retailer selling it. There's probably we actually have 20 uniform license types in our database that we standardize, I think 300. If you think about what CRB Monitor does, is we're standardizing hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of license types and entities into a standard, cohesive, centralized database. So since we cover 42 US states and territories, everybody uses different language. Some states are vertically integrated, other states aren't. But the point is, all of those entities are generally what I would call Tier 1 marijuana-related businesses, again, plant touching. And that's what makes up pretty much all of the databases, these Tier 1, 42,000 direct marijuana-related businesses. The concept of Tier 2 and Tier 3 is basically indirect marijuana-related businesses, and we just split the concept indirect into indirect, but marijuana focused, meaning these are businesses, ancillary businesses that are selling products and services to Tier 1 businesses. The majority, I think when I wrote the paper, I think I used the word substantial revenue was derived from Tier 1 marijuana related businesses, whether it's selling them fertilizer or armored car services, whatever it is, doesn't really matter. But substantial revenue comes from Tier 1 marijuana businesses versus Tier 3, which is indirect, but it's incidental revenue. So maybe that's a CPA who filed one Secretary of State filing, right? The general contractor who put up a fence. So it's definitional. Even between Tier 2 and Tier 3, it's usually the banks, my clients determine what the literal interpretation is, meaning I use this word substantial to differentiate between tier 2 and tier 3. But most banks, I know, ultimately have to put some sort of percentage on that definition. I've seen banks put the percentage as high as 60%, meaning if somebody is not making at least 60% of their revenue from direct marijuana businesses, I'm not going to treat them as an MRB. On the flip side, I've seen clients who have a definition as low as 10% of revenue coming from direct MRBs, and they treat those as tier 2. So I put out the framework, and I think people have evolved it kind of their own needs and interpretations. But ultimately, it's direct versus indirect. Direct, plant touching, generally licensed marijuana businesses. In my database parlance, that's a tier 1A. They must have at least one license. It can be of any license type. We do, and we'll get to this on future slides, it could be of different license status. And then tier 2 and tier 3 are indirect marijuana businesses.
So remember when we started our conversation said it's more complex than just marijuana-related businesses? I think that also highlights it. It starts to get complex. And I also think one thing that you mentioned is interesting, and I think really good to call out for, for our audience that's here today is, we, as an industry, right, just genuinely think in terms of a risk-based approach, right, based off of what your risk appetite is as an organization. And I think some of the call-outs that you made from different clients, right, 60% and 10%, those are extreme differences. And I think align to your risk tolerance, within your institution. So I think that's one thing, certainly to note for everyone in the audience, the good news is about 73% have written policies based off of the poll, which I think is fantastic. I think, as others are looking to make decisions on, what controls might you put in place as you start to take on maybe working with MRBs, then, one of the things to consider is exactly that. What Steve just walked through is what level, number one, what's your risk tolerance? You're very familiar with that. But then next level, what does that mean in the context of MRB? Is it just direct? Or do you want to expand and look at what does that mean from an indirect perspective? And again, I go back to, that's really one of the reasons why we were excited to partner together, is because we very much take that approach from a Refinitiv perspective around data, right? Make sure it's clearly defined from a regulatory standpoint, from an institutional standpoint. You clearly understand where the data is coming from, why, what's the meaning behind it, and what's the source material behind it. So, Steve, one of the things that you mentioned was taking all of the different disparate data and pulling that together and then normalizing it into the framework of tier 1, tier 2, not to mention the fact that you have to normalize it from state to state. That's been something that's come up several times with some of our clients that we've personally worked with, in saying, well, I start to look at the data to make sure I've got the right licensing data. But then when you start to look across states, some are delivering it in PDFs, some are delivering it in flat files, some are delivering it, their license structure is very different. So how are you making sure that you're pulling in that data, keeping that updated? And certainly, right, we have new states that have just passed legalization recently. So that's an added layer of complexity.
Yeah, no, it's a little bit about my personality. I spent most of Thanksgiving working on puzzles. And when I work on puzzles, I put all my borders and corners in the side, and then I color code all the sections in the groups, and then I work from there. So it's not dissimilar from that. It is, it's data wrangling 101. It's not exactly rocket science, but it is, algebra or pre-calc, more than just basic arithmetic, because out of the 40, there's 42 U.S. states and territories that we cover, plus 10 plus in Canada, plus Health Canada, plus the DEA, plus the FDA. So I think there's approximately 82 what we call license authorities that we track and monitor constantly. Now, each of these agencies, as you correctly stated, they publish information in different formats, on different frequencies of different richness levels, if you will. So some will just give you the basics, and some will give you, turn over entire application documents that are redacted, if you ask. Most of what we get is in various forms online, even if that includes, again, online spreadsheets or PDFs. But we do get a fair amount of information from offline sources, meaning I file public records requests to get beneficial ownership in certain states, to get redacted copies of application documents, to get license status updates where it isn't readily available online. So it's a combination of basically all the tools or tricks in the bag. There is some automation of scraping, but I think we actually only have, out of the 80 agencies, only about 25 of them can actually be automatically scraped. And even that scraping, CRB Monitor doesn't just simply scrape and dump, meaning we just don't just scrape everything and throw it in willy-nilly. We're trying to avoid creating duplicate records, because in a state like California, you have 3 marijuana licensing agencies, and you might have the same entities reported is licensed by each of the agencies differently, meaning they might have a cultivation license from Cal Cannabis, might have a processing and manufacturing license from, I think it's Department of Health, some sub-bureau, and then they might have a retail license. And one might be Joe's Pot Shop, Inc., no comma, no period. The next one might be Joe's Pot Shop, ', no ink. And the third one might be Joe's Pot Shop. So my team is going through with every new record and trying to avoid duplicates. And we're doing that across the board. And we do have defined, really, we're checking everything. We're manually and or automatically checking everything at least once a week. But that doesn't necessarily mean each agency updates that frequently. So if you're in New York, for example, or Florida, there's only, I think, 22 licensed MRBs in Florida. I think it's only 10 or 12 in New York. So I just know naturally that there isn't that much going on in New York, but I'm watching to see if there's legislative changes, or New Jersey maybe is a better example. So it's basically a large puzzle that I enjoy doing naturally, and it's just good project management to identify the relevant agencies, identify the information that's available online, and if it's not available online, trying to get it through offline manners. And again, centralizing and standardizing and normalizing it, which is a great word, normalizing all the information, because in New Jersey, it's called a alternative therapy center, right? In Florida, it's called something else. In New York, it's called something else. So we also standardize or map all of those reported license types into what we call a uniform license type. So we just say cultivation, for example, as an example, or vertically integrated. Same thing with license status. You have businesses that might be in the act of applying for a license, or maybe they've been awarded a license but aren't yet active, or maybe they're active, or maybe they were active but now suspended. So all of those machinations across the board is all we think about all day long, every day, versus, and we're the only company that does it like that. We're the only company that's focused on this one thing, and I'm trying to be the best in the world at this one thing. Did I answer the question, Holly? Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, look, that's a question that anybody in industry that's pulling data is going to ask, right? What's in the data set, how's it compiled, sources, and then most importantly, right, how do you look at updating the data itself? Right. Which I keep referring back to the folks that are on the line in the industry as well, which this is really geared towards making sure that we give some best practices, talk about some red flags, but to open up. So we, welcome any questions as well. So I've seen a couple just popping in within the chat. So you feel free, please, to, pop in any questions. Steve and I will be happy to take a look at that and get it answered given time constraints, but then also we're happy to take those away and follow up individually afterwards as well. So please, for everybody that's on the line, any any questions that you have, whether that be around data, legislation, we could, like I think we've done, we can offer some opinions. No crystal ball, unfortunately, but happy to answer any of those questions. Just as we kind of proceed through, we talked a little bit about what's in the data, the different categories. One of the things that we touched on briefly was the beneficial owner and that you do go more broad. That's a question that continues to come up quite a bit, because I think when we look at, from an industry perspective, again, very familiar, risk-based approach, right, based off your risk tolerance, et cetera, we see that also varies very much within how do you define and how do you look at beneficial ownership. Certainly, there's regulatory guidelines around that. That's starting point A. But then you look at, do you go 50%? Do you go 10%? Do you go more broad to board members, executives? How far do you go? So can you talk to us a little bit about why it's important that you go beyond just, straight ownership? Because I think that's something that's very unique to your data set as well, that you do look at it beyond, and there's very specific reasons as to why from a risk perspective.
Right. You know me well, Holly. I'm very specific about everything I do, or at least in this part of my life, very specific. And one thing, just as you were talking, it's worth reiterating on the prior slide. I don't think you have to go back, but the data product, the MRB Check powered by CRB Monitor, the data is today exclusively direct marijuana-related business information. So it's only as of today, it is only tier 1 marijuana-related business information. And that's, again, based on the feedback I got from clients and as I was developing the database over the past 6 years, saying, Steve, today I only want to screen for direct marijuana-related businesses. Not to mention the availability of the information, everything I just kind of described is with the direct MRBs, there are known sources you can go to. There's reliable government agencies that you can reasonably rely upon for accurate information, which is all of my information is directly taken from the government agencies. Occasionally, there might be something from a media account, but 99% of my MRBs are all directly from the horse's mouth, if you will. And we support all of that with the documentation, even if it's an offline public record request, right? Because my clients always need that backup, that support, that information that says, how do you have this information that no one else has? I just dig harder is basically the answer. I'm more annoying to government agencies than everyone else because this is all I do. So to go to UBOs, it's not dissimilar. It is a bit of a broader net than your traditional, I only want the 25% owners of an MRB. And it goes back to the FinCEN guidance that explicitly calls out as a red flag, watch out for owners and managers, using personal accounts to commingle marijuana-related proceeds. That being said, most definitions I've seen, including various ACAMs, white papers, usually is going to go beyond just your owner investors to include board members, board of directors, that is, corporate officers. Again, that's generally your senior corporate officers, your president, vice president, treasurer, secretary, your secretary of state, executives, your CEO, CFO, COO, CIO, chief medical officers, a common one at these MRBs. So those are kind of the four, middle of the fairway, typical beneficial ownership. I occasionally get the question about, what about owners? I only want owners greater than 25%. I kind of have two pragmatic answers to that. One, the percentage ownership is almost never available in the public record that we're getting. Usually it'll just be, here's a list of owners of this MRBs. It almost never comes with any ownership percentage. And that changes frequently. So it's really just, here's a list of some owners, and that's the true economic owners. And the other point is, marijuana is illegal. All my clients who bank MRBs require 100% ownership turnover, not just the top 25. They want to know every single person who has any ownership. I do think that's starting to fall a little bit or loosen up a little bit, but it's still very low. It's like 5% or maybe 10%, or even states that are, requiring, all the states require the MRBs to turn over beneficial ownership. It's just a question whether or not I can get the state to give it to me. But like Georgia, who is in the act of legalizing, I think they have a 5% threshold. So the percentage threshold, I think banks really they should consider and or require having a different threshold on MRBs. So whether you're screening for them to screen out or whether you're onboarding them, you really want to know as much as you can. The two categories that are kind of broader are senior manager and non-commercial registered agent. Senior manager is really people who we identify that are licensed to work at an MRB. This is specific to a handful of states. Like in Illinois, it's, I think the term is registered agent in charge, which is not to be confused with a registered agent on your Secretary of State, but that's an actual title for somebody who is in charge of a marijuana business. If that information is available, I'm going to aggregate it. And then non-commercial registered agents, generally that's when we match a business up to a Secretary of State entity. We'll look at the registered agent, and if he or she does not appear to be a commercial registered agent, meaning just an attorney or CPA or CE Corp or whatever I use in Delaware for my registration, like those people are often, owners or investors or managers of these MRBs. And what's important to note here, both on the beneficial owners and on the business information, is we include all of these details in the data. So I did that explicitly. So clients who said, hypothetically, I should know all my clients today actually screen for everybody. But hypothetically, I was looking forward saying, well, some clients might not want to screen for senior managers or registered agents, or maybe they only want to screen for owner investors on the beneficial owners. So it's not just, hey, here's a list of these 70,000 people, but it's a list of 70,000 people, with whatever address information we can get with their relationships to the MRBs, with the what we call the role of that person to the MRB. So the person's an owner, they'll be tagged an owner, et cetera, et cetera. Similar thing on the MRBs. It's not just a list of MRBs. It's the MRBs with their licensing information. Is it medical? Is it recreational? Is it cultivation? Is it vertically integrated? Is it testing? Some banks don't agree with me. I think testing is a tier 1 MRB. But the point is, we define all of these things, we tag them, and we make it so that our clients have the option to filter, select, include, exclude. Hypothetically, if they so choose, although today, given most people's risk tolerance, they just want to know, does this thing touch marijuana? Yes or no? But I anticipate that continuing to grow. And again, that's from the screening out perspective. From the screening in, this is all information that the banks who bank MRBs also want to know. Generally, they can get it from the MRB themselves or from the licensing agency themselves. But again, I'm saving a lot of time and trouble by centralizing all of that information, standardizing it, tagging it, et cetera.
So I think one of the things, and you mentioned it, right? So those that are banking marijuana related businesses, how they consume that data. And certainly there's a level of validation that they need to do, right? On their own with the data sources that they have available to them. One of the things that is interesting is one of the clients that, they do a great job making sure that as they're banking those marijuana related businesses, they've got the right controls in place. But one of the questions that came up at one point in time was the requirement that they have to understand the licensing, making sure that the license was valid for that state. And I think I've heard that a few times now in how do I make sure, right, that they have the right level of license, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it's important to call out that that really isn't the responsibility of the institution to make sure that that individual is holding the proper license. That's the job of the state to do that level of validation. What's important to know is what's, the license here defined as tier 1 direct, and then, how they operate and who those individuals, beneficial owners, as we call them, are, but not necessarily, I need to know that they applied for the appropriate license and are operating within that licensing framework. That's still left up to the state. Do you find that causing some level of complexity when working with clients as they're starting to build that program out?
At the point of onboarding a new client, it's making sure that the entity is duly licensed, right? It's not, you don't have to recreate the work, and this is my opinion as well, and you might get different opinions from others. You don't have to recreate the work of the state, in my opinion, doing all the background checks, on the MRB, like any other regulated industry. If it's guns and ammo or MSB, if the entity has a license, MSB license or gun and ammo license or whatever it is, adult entertainment, you can reasonably rely upon the state. I think the federal government has also said that as relates to MRBs. That being said, there's a difference between checking that their license is accurate and relevant at the point of onboarding, but then there's also the ongoing monitoring of that license. Meaning, so they were good yesterday, but what about 6 months from now if their license gets suspended or revoked or terminated? MRBs, unfortunately, don't usually volunteer that information. So unless you yourself as the banker are going to go and check that on some frequency, whether it's quarterly, monthly, or daily, you're not going to do it daily. But that's where you can use CRB Monitor to do that type of thing, like get notified of a change in license status, hypothetically. Does that answer your question, Holly?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's also just good, from an audience perspective to understand, right, where some of those questions can come up as you're building out that policy. We do. Yeah. So one of the questions that we have that's come up is around the licensing framework. So some marijuana authorities release data on MRBs within the licensing application process, so not upon approval. Does your data set pick that up, or are you waiting until an approval status?
Yeah, we pick them up as soon as we can. So list of applicants, we're adding, I'm trying to think of a recent state like West Virginia. As soon as there's a published list of MRB applicants, we will add that if it's publicly available. So try to explain this quickly because I'm getting long-winded. We only have 8 minutes left. So if you have, and this varies again by state to state to state. So some states, we typically call a given state either a rolling state or a periodic state. And that basically means if it's rolling, it's licensing new entities all the time. California, Colorado, I'm going to say Oregon and Washington, although I think there might be some caps or moratoriums in one of those states. But rolling states constantly issuing new licenses. A periodic state like in New York or Florida, basically periodic / dormant, meaning they license their 10 entities in New York or 22 entities in Florida. Other than some lawsuits, there isn't really new activity. But somewhere like, again, West Virginia, they say, hey, we got 100 applicants for this license type, for cultivation licenses, and they'll publish that list of applicants. Boom, those go right in the CRB Monitor. Sorry for the boom. Go right into CRB Monitor with a license, cultivation type, and status pre-license, which basically says they're in the act of applying for license. At some point down the road, the state then says, okay, out of these 100 applicants, we selected 30 you're the winners. Well, those 30 applicants, their license status then changes to pending approved. The 70 losers go into, frankly, the loser category. We call them failed applicants, and their license status changes. So that's where there's 42,000 MRBs, but then there's 100,000 licenses. Those 100,000 licenses are how you define or categorize or understand the nature of the underlying MRB. Because it's not just, it is a marijuana business, but it's marijuana business with one or more licenses. And this is also important, like I use the California example, is it can have multiple licenses of different types of different statuses. So it might be pending approved of one license status, but then active of another. So you have to look at the whole picture holistically, in my opinion, to really understand the nature of the MRB. Again, we're the only ones, I think, doing that.
Great. So another question, and I know we're coming up on time. So again, feel free to put your questions in. We'll grab them now, and those that we don't get to, we'll follow up post the webinar. But so another question, is what are, as you're working with clients that are putting the policy framework in place, right? What are some of the things that you see maybe get not missed, but that aren't thought of, I would say, initially, right? Is that, what are maybe some of the key best practices that you've seen from clients where, everyone should keep those in mind when they're building out their policy, whether it is to onboard or deciding not to onboard?
Yeah, I want to say as it relates to the onboarding, so banks who have decided to set up a marijuana banking program, I'm going to start with that one first, because usually from what I've seen, that's a several month process, and there's lots and lots and lots and lots of thought that goes into that from the compliance officers, from consultants, from experts in the space. I'll say like myself, I don't really specialize in BSA, AML consulting per se, just the MRB data. But for those who are looking to set up programs, usually they're extremely thorough. So I'm actually going to refer to those who at the start of the call, who say they don't bank marijuana and the common faults that I see. And I'm going to leverage some of the survey results, which I did snap a screenshot of. So for example, the good news is 73% of respondents from our survey earlier said they have written cannabis policies, which is great. Now, some of the catches are the second question: do you differentiate between marijuana, hemp, and CBD? 38% of the respondents said yes, that they differentiate between marijuana, hemp, and CBD. The next question was, do you differentiate between, the question technically said, do you differentiate between tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, AKA direct or indirect? 41% said yes. So the good news is 73% have written policies. The catch, and this is a common fault, and I understand why, and it's just natural as we all learn about this industry, is the non-differentiation between hemp, marijuana, and CBD is a problem. Because what I see is people say, I have a no cannabis policy. Really what they mean is I have a no marijuana policy. Really what they mean is I have a no marijuana direct policy. So I have a whole risk matrix around this that defines this further. Because if you say we have a no marijuana policy, but then you include hemp and CBD, well, potentially, if your risk appetite is actually open to hemp and CBD, you might be saying no to companies you can actually bank and make money off of. Vice versa, if you say we have a no cannabis policy or no marijuana policy, but then you actually, you don't understand that you're looking at a hemp business, not a marijuana business, or maybe you do, it's largely a definitional thing. So for me, it's carving out explicitly what you won't do. For most banks, that's a hard no today to direct marijuana. And it's a maybe to hemp, it's a maybe to CBD, it's a maybe to tier 2 MRBs. But that's usually the biggest thing I see is this blanket, either no marijuana policy or no cannabis policy, and not bringing it down to the next step, because there's a big difference between hemp and marijuana. And it usually means you're inconsistently applying your policies in your procedures. So maybe you're screening and kicking people out you don't need to be, or maybe you aren't managing the risk because it's hard to tell if you don't understand the definitions.
Perfect. So it reminds me of one of our last conversations that we had in a larger forum with some institutions that do bank marijuanas, and I think marijuanas. And I think we all kept coming back to document. Make sure you explicitly call out who you are doing business with, what the definition around that is, and who you have chosen not to do business with. So we have 1 minute, and there's a couple more questions in here. I'll see if I can grab this one because it's come up a couple times. Are there MRBs in Canada where it's legal at the federal level that have ownership interests in the U.S. based MRB businesses? And are you capturing those within CRB Monitor's data?
Yes and yes. All right, maybe there's 3 questions, but I think they're all yes, as much as we can, as much as we're able to. And then again, that's why we have a relational database. So we're linking a lot of these businesses together so that the whole concept of our 1B business is it's the investment company, it's the parent company, and maybe it's Canadian publicly traded, and we haven't even talked about that, but these publicly traded parent companies that are Canadian based, but they'll have Canadian and US exposure, right? So the short answer is yes.
All right, perfect. And that actually is taking us to the hour. So first and foremost, I'd like to thank everybody for attending today. We appreciate your time, and certainly any questions, reach out to either Steve or myself direct. And then thank you, Steve, for joining us today. We're excited about the partnership.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
And I'll turn it over to Karin for a few quick closing remarks.
Sure. Thanks, Holly. Appreciate it. Lots of great information there. A lot to digest. So, yes, as you mentioned, audience, if you have any questions at all, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We have a short survey that's on your screen. If you would be so kind to take a moment and complete that for us, we do value your input. And as I mentioned at the start of the broadcast, we will be sending out an email that contains a link to the recording of this seminar, as well as a copy of the slide deck and some other resources for you. And you can access the recording on demand. Again, thanks, Holly and Steve. Thanks, audience, for your time and interest today. Be safe, everyone. This event is now concluded.